When you think about the 1970s, the decade when America's gas stations supposedly made their fortunes, you picture the oil crisis, long lines at the pump, rationing, and panic. You imagine station owners getting rich off scarcity and price spikes. That's the narrative everyone tells. But it's almost entirely wrong. The real money in the 70s didn't come from selling fuel. It came from something almost nobody talks about anymore: what happened inside the building behind the pumps. Gas station owners in the 1970s were running what we'd now call a convenience store ecosystem, but they didn't fully understand it yet. The margins on gasoline itself were razor thin, typically 2 to 4 cents per gallon after overhead. That was never where the money lived. But inside that small building, in those final years before the modern gas station convenience store was truly born, there existed an economic paradox that made millionaires out of ordinary people in small towns and suburbs across America. To understand this, we need to start with a question that seems almost quaint now. Why would anyone stop at a gas station besides to buy gas? The answer reveals everything about how these businesses actually generated wealth in that decade. A typical customer pulling in for a fill-up in 1975 wasn't just there for the fuel, they were captive. Their car needed gas. They were stuck there for 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes. And in those minutes, something remarkable happened. Let's talk about the cost structure first, because this is where most histories of the gas station fail. An independent station owner in the mid-1970s typically had an initial investment of between $70,000 and $150,000. That covered the land lease or purchase, the pumps, the underground tanks, the building, the initial inventory. For a small-town operator, this was serious money, equivalent to roughly $500,000 in today's currency. But here's the crucial detail. The economics of that investment didn't rest on fuel sales alone. It never did. When a station owner looked at their daily revenue, they were breaking it into two categories: pump sales and what they called convenience sales or inside sales. Pump sales brought in volume, yes, hundreds of gallons a day, but they also brought in almost no profit. A customer buying 15 gallons at maybe 53 cents per gallon in 1975 was generating about $8 in revenue. The station's cost to acquire that fuel wholesale was nearly $8. The owner pocketed perhaps a dime, maybe 20 cents on a good day with good margins. But that same customer, standing there for 10 minutes waiting, with nothing to do, nowhere to go, was walking into the building, and that's where the real business happened. A pack of cigarettes at a 40% markup, a cup of coffee at 50 cents with a cost of maybe 12 cents, a road map, a pack of gum, a bottle of motor oil, windshield washer fluid, a candy bar, a magazine. These weren't side hustles. For many station owners, inside sales represented 40 to 50% of total daily revenue, and they carried margins of 30 to 50%, some days higher. Think about the math on this. A station that pumped 3,000 gallons a day, which was solid for a smaller location, might generate $400 in pump revenue and $8 in profit. But if inside sales added another $200 in revenue daily and carried a 40% margin, that was $80 in pure profit. Just from the convenience side, the pump was the traffic driver. The inside sales were the money machine. This is what we need to understand about the 1970s specifically. The oil crisis created a psychological shift. Lines at pumps became normal. Government rationing programs made fuel appointments matter. You had to plan your fill-ups. Customers began understanding gas stations not as quick stops but as necessary destinations. They'd arrive, settle in, accept the wait, and make the most of those captive minutes. The station owner had captured their time, and they monetized it relentlessly, though not aggressively. This was the era of filler up and I'll grab a coffee and a pack of smokes. The cigarette business alone deserves its own examination. A pack of cigarettes in 1975 cost the station owner roughly 30 cents to purchase from their distributor. They sold it for 70 cents to 80 cents. That's a 50% margin on a high-velocity product. A station selling 300 packs a day, which wasn't unusual, was generating $150 in cigarette revenue and $75 in profit daily. In a month, that's $2,200 from cigarettes alone, no rent, no utilities tied to that calculation. Pure profit layered on top of the infrastructure already required for the fuel business. But cigarettes were just the beginning. The beverage business was equally important, and it operated on even better economics. A station might stock 30 to 50 cases of soft drinks, coffee supplies, and sometimes beer in the back. A case of Coca-Cola cost the station owner about $3.75 wholesale in the mid-70s. The station would sell individual bottles or cans to customers at 20 cents for a small, maybe 30 cents for a large. If they sold 60 cans per day, achievable in any moderately busy location, that was $12 in daily revenue and maybe $4 to $5 in profit. Monthly, $150 just from beverages. The coffee operation was perhaps the most elegant from a profit perspective. A station owner would buy a commercial coffee maker, not terribly expensive, and bulk instant or percolated coffee. A cup cost maybe 12 cents in materials and overhead. It sold for 30 cents, sometimes 35. The velocity on coffee was extraordinary during morning hours. A moderately busy station could sell 100 cups between 6 and 10 in the morning. That's $20 in revenue, $9 in profit, before the sun was fully up. And it required almost no labor if the owner worked the counter themselves, which many did. Road maps were another revenue stream that's completely invisible to modern analysis. In the 1970s, road maps were not free. A detailed state map or a regional map cost the customer 25 to 50 cents. A station bought them from distributors for about a nickel. The markup was 400 to 500%, and people bought them constantly. A family planning a vacation would pop in and grab 3 or 4 maps. A trucker needed updated regional guides. A salesman needed an up-to-date state map. Even though the transaction value was small, the volume and margins meant that road maps could generate $10 to $15 a day in profit for an active station. None of this is captured in the narratives about the oil crisis made gas stations rich. The oil crisis actually made pump profits worse by increasing volatility and reducing turnover per dollar. What made gas stations rich in the 1970s was a specific economic arrangement: high foot traffic, captive customers, long dwell times, and a product mix that carried healthy margins. The station was a forced marketplace, and the owner controlled the inventory. Let's look at a concrete example. Imagine a mid-sized independent station in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, in 1976. The owner, let's call him Frank, took over the station in 1972 with an initial investment of $90,000. He worked the pumps and counter himself. His daily volume was respectable but not extraordinary: 2,200 gallons of fuel, maybe 70 inside transactions beyond the pump attendant's sales. Frank's monthly volume, 66,000 gallons. At a wholesale cost of approximately 50 cents per gallon in 1976, his fuel cost him about $33,000. He sold it at roughly 55 cents per gallon. The margin was thin, but prices were rising. His fuel revenue was about $36,000 monthly. His gross profit on fuel, $3,000. After paying for credit card processing, which took about 2%, after paying his one part-time pump attendant, after utilities, after a small rent or lease payment, Frank's net from fuel was maybe $1,000 a month. But inside sales, Frank sold between $400 and $500 in convenience items daily. Let's say $450. That's $13,500 monthly, at an average margin of 38%, which accounts for higher margin items like cigarettes and coffee offsetting lower margins on things like ice or newspapers. Frank was generating $5,100 in gross profit from inside sales. After minimal overhead specific to that category, he was netting probably $4,000 monthly just from the convenience side. Do you see the inversion? Frank's fuel business was a high-volume, low-profit operation that generated roughly $1,000 in monthly net profit. His convenience business was a moderate-volume, healthy-margin operation that generated $4,000 in monthly net profit. The fuel pumps were the marketing expense. The convenience store was the actual business. Over a year, Frank's station would clear approximately $60,000 in profit. That's a 66% return on his initial investment annually. In a good year, with higher margins or better location, he could approach $80,000. This is not accounting for any salary he took as the operator. Many station owners didn't separate out what they paid themselves. If we factor in that Frank worked the pumps and counter, his effective annual income might be $90,000 to $100,000 for a 7-day-a-week operation. In 1976 currency, this made him solidly middle to upper middle class. Not rich, but genuinely prosperous. The question that matters for understanding the 70s is this: why was the convenience side so profitable? And the answer involves the unique moment in time when the nation's infrastructure hadn't yet optimized around convenience. There were no Circle K chains in most markets. There were no 7-Elevens saturating the suburbs. The gas station was one of the few places where you could reliably pick up a coffee, a snack, a cigarette, and a road map simultaneously. The station owner wasn't competing against a convenient ecosystem of specialty retailers. They were the convenience ecosystem. If you needed a coffee at 9 in the morning and you were passing a gas station, you stopped. There was nowhere else to go. This created a natural monopoly within the customer's immediate geography. The oil crisis, when it arrived in 1973 and again in 1979, actually disrupted this perfect arrangement temporarily. But it also intensified one critical aspect: dwell time. When lines formed at the pump, customers waited longer. They got antsy. They went inside, and while they waited, they bought. The psychological state of the captive customer waiting in line is entirely different from the customer with options. The station that in 1972 might have sold $40 in daily inside sales suddenly found customers spending $50 or $60 daily once the lines started forming. For station owners who had the supply and the inventory management to capitalize on this shift, it was extraordinary. A station that had typically stocked $100 worth of inside inventory might suddenly stock $300 worth. The velocity on that inventory was rapid enough to turn it 3 to 4 times monthly. The profit margins on the additional inventory meant that an aggressive owner could increase their monthly profit by $2,000 to $3,000 simply by having stock on hand that customers wanted to buy during their wait. This is the hidden story of gas station fortunes in the 1970s. Not that fuel prices made owners rich, but that fuel created the foot traffic that made the convenience business rich. And the 1970s were the last decade in American history when this arrangement was purely local and didn't yet face systematic national competition. The station owner was playing a game that required understanding 3 separate profit centers, each with different dynamics. The fuel business was high volume, price-sensitive, and subject to wholesale cost volatility. The convenience business was moderate volume, margin-driven, and entirely within the owner's control. And there was a third dimension that almost nobody talks about anymore: the service business. Oil changes, tire repairs, battery sales. These were pure margin operations that only existed because customers showed up for fuel. A customer might come in for 15 gallons of gas. While the pump was running, they'd ask if someone could check their oil or rotate their tires or replace a battery that was failing. The station owner or a part-time mechanic could do this work. A battery sale that cost $40 wholesale could be sold for $70. A tire rotation that took 20 minutes and required minimal equipment could be charged $15. An oil change that cost $5 in materials could be charged $12. These weren't major revenue items, but they were margin items that lived on top of the convenience business, which lived on top of the fuel business. The complete profit structure of Frank's Columbus station then looked something like this: $1,000 monthly from fuel, $4,000 monthly from inside convenience sales, $500 monthly from service and mechanical work. Total monthly profit, $5,500. Over a year, $66,000. But here's what the narratives about the 1970s fuel crisis completely miss. The best-positioned station owners were the ones who had already built their convenience operations before the crisis hit. By 1973, when the embargo began, the infrastructure was in place. The owner had suppliers for cigarettes, beverages, snacks. They had relationships with distributors. They had learned the patterns of customer demand. When the crisis hit and foot traffic surged, they could simply increase orders and ride the wave. The owners who got crushed by the 70s were those who still thought of themselves primarily as fuel retailers. They'd underinvested in convenience inventory. They didn't have strong supplier relationships. When demand spiked, they couldn't fulfill it. They lost sales, and worse, they lost the profit opportunity at a moment when customer wallets were open. Meanwhile, the sophisticated operators, the ones who understood that they were running a captive retail operation that happened to have gas pumps, those owners used the crisis as an amplifier for margins they'd already built. This reality that gas station fortunes came from convenience, not fuel, created an unexpected economic dynamic. Station owners began viewing their real estate differently. The land underneath the station wasn't valuable because it was a good place to sell fuel. It was valuable because it was a captive retail location with built-in foot traffic. This shift in mentality set the stage for everything that came after: the eventual dominance of gas station convenience stores, the rise of brands like Speedway and Circle K, the eventual commoditization of fuel, and the real profit consolidation around the inside sales. If you look at a Speedway station in 1985, you're looking at a building designed primarily as a convenience store with gas pumps attached. Compare that to a station from 1970, which was designed primarily as a fuel retailer with a small shop in the back. The shift is architectural, yes, but it's fundamentally economic. The owners had figured out where the money actually was, and the physical infrastructure followed that realization. The 70s were the bridge decade. The 1960s had created the car culture and the assumption of cheap gas. The 1980s would create the convenience store as we know it. But the 1970s, with its chaos, its lines, its rationing, its price volatility, forced station owners to confront an uncomfortable truth. They were retailers first, fuel distributors second, and that truth made fortunes for those who understood it. This is the economic story of the 70s that nobody tells. Not a story of fuel-driven inflation and crisis-driven profits, but a story of how local business owners, Frank in Columbus and thousands of others like him in suburbs and small towns, discovered that their real business had been hidden inside the building the whole time. The pumps were the advertisement, the store was the gold mine. But here is where the story becomes more complex. Because Frank's station, and stations like it across America, didn't operate in isolation. They were part of a larger ecosystem of brand loyalty, contractual obligation, and brand name gasoline that we rarely examine with this kind of financial clarity. You see, Frank didn't own the Shell brand, Shell owned the relationship, and that relationship came with a cost structure that most station owners didn't fully understand until the 70s, forced them to look at their P&L statements with fresh eyes. Here's what happened. When Frank signed his lease agreement with Shell in 1965, he agreed to purchase his gasoline exclusively from Shell at their wholesale rate. That rate was typically 3 to 5 cents below the retail price he charged customers. On a busy day when Frank pumped 500 gallons, that margin, roughly $20 to $50, felt substantial, and it was. For decades, it was enough. But the 70s changed the math entirely. Suddenly, the margin was being compressed from both directions. OPEC was pushing wholesale prices upward faster than Frank could legally raise his pump price due to price controls in some states. At the same time, customers were becoming more price sensitive. They'd drive past his station for an extra penny per gallon savings. The fuel margin, which had been his anchor, was becoming unreliable. This is where the station owners who survived, truly thrived, made their critical move. They realized something that Shell's corporate office in Houston wasn't emphasizing in their franchise materials. The fuel margin was dying. It would never return to its old levels, but the store margin was expanding. Cigarettes, which cost Shell's distributor about 20 cents a pack wholesale, could be retailed for 50 cents. Candy that cost 8 cents could sell for 20. Motor oil, windshield wipers, air fresheners, spark plugs. These items had margins of 40 to 50%, and they weren't subject to federal price controls. They weren't subject to OPEC. They were purely local retail economics. So the owners who prospered weren't the ones who optimized their fuel throughput. They were the ones who optimized their impulse purchase design. They studied their customer traffic patterns. They realized that a customer filling a 10-gallon tank would spend 4 minutes at the pump. In those 4 minutes, they needed something to do, something to look at, a reason to go inside. Frank expanded his store footprint from 120 square feet to nearly 300. He installed a second cooler for soft drinks and beer. He added a small hot food program, roller-grilled hot dogs and pre-made sandwiches that could sit in a heated case all day. He installed a restroom with a door and a lock, which immediately elevated his customer experience above 3 competing stations within a mile. He added fluorescent lighting over the candy aisle specifically, understanding that impulse purchases happened in bright light, when products were easy to see and grab. These weren't revolutionary changes, but they were changes based on data. Frank kept careful records. He tracked which candy items sold fastest. He noted the time of day when his beer sales peaked. He observed that Friday and Saturday nights saw a 20% increase in impulse spending, and he staffed accordingly. He understood his hourly revenue per square foot, and he knew which products generated the highest velocity of sales. By 1978, Frank's store operations, everything except the gasoline, accounted for 35% of his total revenue. By 1982, that number had climbed to nearly 45%. The fuel was the traffic driver, the store was the profit engine. And this is crucial, because it reveals something about the 70s that economists and historians often miss. The oil crisis wasn't a simple story of prices rising and profits falling. For the people who owned the physical real estate where fuel was sold, the gas station operators, the crisis created an opportunity to completely restructure their business model. The scarcity of fuel, the regulation of prices, and the desperation of customers actually pushed station owners toward higher-margin businesses. They became retailers. Some became quite wealthy doing so. But wealth, when it came, required a specific kind of owner, not a fuel expert, a business operator, Someone who understood inventory turnover, margin structure, and customer behavior. Someone willing to clean the restroom twice a day and study the sales of individual candy brands like they were stock portfolios. Frank was one of these people. And by the early 1980s, when the crisis finally eased and fuel prices stabilized, Frank had already transformed his station into something Shell's corporate office hadn't anticipated. A profitable enterprise that no longer depended primarily on fuel margins to stay alive. This created a fascinating paradox. The major oil companies had designed their franchise agreements around fuel sales. They owned the brand. They controlled the wholesale price. They benefited from increased fuel volume. But they had largely ignored the economics of the building where that fuel was sold. In the 70s, that ignorance became their weakness. Some major brands tried to respond. Chevron, for instance, began developing its own convenience store formats in the late 70s and early 80s. They called them Chevron Extra. The idea was to standardize the in-store experience, control inventory, and leverage their brand to drive margins. They installed modern shelving, standardized lighting, and centralized purchasing. It was a smart move, but it also reduced the autonomy of individual operators like Frank. He could no longer choose his hot dog vendor or negotiate directly with the candy distributor. He was now managing a format designed by corporate. Other majors did nothing. Mobil, for example, maintained their traditional approach to franchise relationships well into the 80s. They offered no guidance on store layout, no recommendations on product mix, no training in impulse retail. Their theory was simple. We provide the fuel, you run the station however you want. It was a model that worked fine in the 1960s. In the 70s, it meant Mobil franchise owners had to figure out the convenience store revolution entirely on their own. Frank's station was technically a Shell franchise, which meant he had some corporate guidance, but nothing like what Chevron was beginning to impose. He existed in a middle ground where he had enough autonomy to optimize his operation for his local market, but enough corporate structure to benefit from Shell's brand and supply chain relationships. This is the often overlooked story of gas station economics in the 70s. Not a narrative of oil companies controlling everything, but a narrative of independent entrepreneurs discovering that their success or failure depended less on the fuel they sold and more on how they managed the retail environment they'd built inside a prefabricated structure provided by someone else. Now, to understand the full financial picture of Frank's operation by 1980, we need to move beyond his margins and examine his fixed costs. Because margins meant nothing if fixed costs consumed everything he earned. A typical gas station in the 70s had substantial fixed expenses that many casual observers overlooked. Rent, whether Frank owned the property or leased it, was a constant burden. If he owned the land, his property tax ran roughly $3 to $4,000 annually in his Columbus suburb. If he leased from Shell, his rent was typically structured as a percentage of sales, usually around 7 to 8%, or a flat monthly fee of $1 to $2, whichever was higher. Then there were utilities. A 24-hour gas station with bright exterior lighting, internal climate control for the convenience store, and hot water for the restroom could run a monthly electric bill of $4,000 to $6,000. Natural gas for heating could add another $2,000 to $3 in winter months. Water and sewage might run another $5 to $7 monthly. Insurance was substantial. Frank's policy covered liability for the pumps and the store, property damage, workers' compensation if he had employees, and coverage for the underground storage tanks. Underground tanks were a particular concern. They could leak. Environmental liability was beginning to become a regulatory issue in the late 70s, and insurance companies were adjusting their premiums accordingly. Frank's annual insurance premium in 1975 was roughly $2,400. By 1980, it had climbed to $3,800. Then there was maintenance. The pumps required regular service and calibration, the underground tanks needed to be inspected, the convenience store refrigeration units broke down and needed repair, the roof developed leaks, the asphalt needed resealing. These were irregular expenses, but they were predictable over time. Frank budgeted roughly $2 annually for maintenance, though some years it ran higher. Staffing was perhaps the largest variable expense. By 1980, Frank couldn't run the station alone, especially if he wanted to optimize the convenience store operations. He needed at least one full-time employee, typically a manager, and several part-time employees to cover evening and overnight hours. The full-time manager might earn $1,500 to $1,800 annually. Part-time attendants, paid minimum wage, which had risen to $3.10 per hour by 1980, needed to cover roughly 70 to 80 hours weekly. That represented an annual payroll for part-time staff of roughly $1.200 to $1 full-time staff. In total, Frank's payroll was running approximately $2.800 to $3.200 annually. Add employers' contribution to Social Security, and the total labor cost approached $3.500. So Frank's basic fixed costs, rent or property tax, utilities, insurance, maintenance, and payroll, totaled roughly $5.500 to $6.500 annually. But Frank's revenue in 1980 was approximately $2.8000 $20.00 annually. That meant his fixed costs represented 17 to 23% of gross revenue. On the surface, this looked healthy. 40% of revenues went to the cost of goods sold, primarily gasoline and convenience store inventory, leaving roughly 35 to 40% for fixed costs and profit. But those numbers obscured something crucial. The profit didn't come from the fuel, the profit came from the store. If Frank sold 50,000 gallons of gasoline annually at an average margin of 4 cents per gallon, his fuel margin was $2.000. If his store sales were $7.500 annually at an average margin of 35%, his store margin was $2.620. Suddenly the structure becomes clear. The fuel operation generated roughly 7% of his profit margin. The convenience store generated roughly 93%. This was the revolution that the 70s created, and it was a revolution that only the owners who understood their numbers could exploit. But here's where the story gets deeper. Understanding the margin split between fuel and convenience sales wasn't just about bookkeeping clarity. It was about survival strategy, because once you saw that 93% of your profit came from the store, you had to ask yourself a very different question. Why are you still in the fuel business at all? The answer was customer traffic. Fuel brought people to your property. That was the entire point. You could not survive on fuel margins alone. Most station owners in the 70s made between $8,000 and $12,000 annually on fuel operations. But that same traffic, once captured, could be monetized in ways that gasoline companies never anticipated. A station owner named Marcus in rural Ohio operated a 400-square-foot store area attached to his 8-pump station. In 1974, his fuel sales totaled 62.00 gallons. His store inventory included hot dogs, beef jerky, magazines, candy, soft drinks, and cigarettes, roughly 200 SKUs total. His daily foot traffic was approximately 140 transactions. Most customers purchased fuel only, but roughly 30% of them also bought something from the store. That 30% of 30% conversion rate, roughly 9% of all customers, generated the bulk of his annual profit. A customer buying a hot dog for 85 cents, a coffee for 40 cents, and a magazine for 60 cents was generating $2.85 in a single transaction. Marcus's cost on that bundle was roughly 90 cents. His margin was $2. That margin was 15 times higher, percentage-wise, than the margin on the gallon of fuel that brought the customer to his door in the first place. But here's the economic layer that most station owners never fully grasped. The store's profitability was directly proportional to traffic volume, and traffic volume was directly proportional to fuel pricing strategy. This created a peculiar economic loop. In the mid-70s, competition for fuel customers was fierce. Price wars were constant. A station owner in a competitive market might drop his fuel price by 2 cents per gallon just to maintain volume. That margin compression on fuel, the already thin margin, hurt, but only in a direct, measurable way. If he sold 5,000 fewer gallons, he lost roughly $2.000 in margin. But he gained something else. By undercutting his competitor down the road, he maintained volume. And maintained volume meant maintained traffic. And maintained traffic meant sustained store sales. A station owner who cut his fuel margin by $2.0000 to maintain traffic might actually protect $15,000 or more in annual store margin by preventing the traffic decline that would have followed. The math was counterintuitive, but it was real. This is why the owners who understood their complete financial picture, not just fuel metrics, but the interdependency between fuel traffic and store margin, were the ones who thrived in the 70s. They didn't compete on fuel, they competed on traffic generation and store experience. They knew their numbers, and their numbers told them a story that their competitors couldn't read. A station owner named Ruth in Pennsylvania took this logic further. In 1975, her station was in a saturated market, 3 competitors within a half-mile radius. All were undercutting each other on fuel. Ruth had a decision to make: drop prices to match theirs, or differentiate. She chose differentiation. She kept her fuel prices 1 cent above the lowest competitor. It cost her approximately 15% of her fuel volume, but she invested heavily in her store. She hired a second clerk for afternoon and evening shifts. She expanded her hot food offerings to include chili, biscuits, and breakfast sandwiches. She kept the store and bathrooms meticulously clean. She installed better lighting. By 1977, Ruth's store sales had grown from $18,000 to $42,000 annually. Her fuel volume had declined by approximately 12%, lowering her fuel margin from $2,400 to roughly $2,100. But her store margin, now calculated at a higher mix of high-margin items like food and coffee, had grown from approximately $6,000 to nearly $15,000. Her total annual profit had increased by roughly 60%, and she had become the least price-competitive station in her market. This was the true 70s revolution. It wasn't about fuel. It was about understanding that the American consumer, caught in an era of economic uncertainty, wanted not just gasoline, but convenience, cleanliness, and the small comforts of ready food and accessible retail. The station owner who grasped this, who read his ledger correctly and saw where his actual profit lived, could build a moat around his business that price competition could never penetrate. And yet, and this is crucial to the full story, the 70s also saw the rise of a new threat that would eventually make this entire operating model obsolete. The large-scale convenience chain. Names like 7-Eleven, Circle K, and Southland were expanding aggressively throughout the decade. These chains had advantages that independent station owners could never match: economies of scale in purchasing, centralized supply chains, brand consistency, and crucially, the ability to operate stores without the fuel operation at all. By 1978, the first gas stations branded with 7-Eleven branding began to appear. Chevron, Texaco, and Shell were beginning to recognize that the profit model Ruth had intuitively grasped was the model of the future. But unlike Ruth, who built it through careful observation and experimentation, the major oil companies had the capital and distribution power to scale it instantly. And scale it they did. For Ruth and thousands of operators like her, this represented the beginning of the end. Not in 1977 or 1978, but the trajectory was set. The independent gas station owner who had survived the oil crises of 1973 and 1974 and learned to profit not from fuel but from convenience retail was now facing a new kind of competition: the industrialized, chain-operated convenience fuel hybrid. A model they could not match, because they lacked the scale, the capital, and the national supply chains that made it work. But that story belongs to the 80s and beyond. In the 70s, the era we're examining, the revolution was still entirely within reach of the owner who understood their numbers well enough to see the future before it arrived. By 1979, the second oil crisis had arrived. This time, it wasn't a surprise embargo, it was the Iranian Revolution, which removed roughly 2 million barrels per day from global supply. Crude prices spiked from $14 a barrel to over $35 by mid-1980, and yet something had fundamentally shifted in the American gas station economy. The operator who had made the transition from fuel-dependent to diversified had already begun insulating themselves from the worst of the price swings. Ruth's station, by late 1979, was generating nearly 40% of gross profit from convenience items and services, not fuel. When crude spiked, her fuel margins compressed again, but her overall business held steady because she was no longer betting everything on the pump. The data from independent operators surveyed by the National Association of Convenience Stores tells this story clearly. In 1970, the average gas station with a small convenience section generated about 8 to 12% of revenue from non-fuel sources. By 1979, that figure had grown to 35 to 40% among the survivors. Among those who didn't survive, that number remained static, often lower. The operators who disappeared were the ones who couldn't or wouldn't adapt. They were still running traditional gas stations in 1978 and 1979, treating the convenience store as an afterthought, a small service window selling maybe $100 in cold drinks and snacks per day. When the second oil shock hit, they had nowhere to hide. In 1980 alone, approximately 4,000 independent gas stations closed in the United States. Not because fuel wasn't being sold. Consumption actually remained high despite the price shock, but because the profit model that had sustained them no longer existed. The fuel margin was essentially gone. Wholesale and retail prices were compressed so tightly that selling gasoline itself became almost a public service, not a business. The stations that survived, like Ruth's, like the thousands of family-owned operations that made it into the 1980s, had fundamentally shifted their identity. They were no longer gas stations that happened to sell convenience items, they were convenience retailers that happened to pump gas. The psychological shift in that distinction cannot be overstated. It required the owner to think differently about their customer, their inventory, their staffing, their profit sources. Ruth, whom we've followed throughout this analysis, made that transition early and deliberately. By 1978, while many of her competitors in the nearby market were still treating the convenience section as an experiment, she had hired a part-time convenience manager, someone whose only job was inventory, ordering, and pricing strategy for non-fuel items. Her wage cost for that position was roughly $18,000 annually by 1979, about 9% of her total operational salary budget. It was one of the best investments she ever made. Because the data on convenience retail pricing in 1978 and 1979 showed something crucial. Margins were far more stable on convenience items than on fuel. A pack of cigarettes purchased wholesale at $2.50 could be retailed at $3.99 in most markets. That was a 40% margin. A case of beer bought at $4.20 per unit could sell at $6.49, a 53% margin. Snacks and dairy products offered similar returns. Compare that to fuel. Unleaded gasoline purchased at 62 cents per gallon in 1978 was retailed at an average of 68 cents, a 9% margin, if you could even hold that spread. By 1979, when wholesale prices fluctuated almost weekly, many operators were fighting for 3 to 5% margins. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. If you wanted to stay in the gas station business, you could not be in the fuel business anymore. This is where the financial complexity deepens significantly, and it's where I want to offer you something more detailed. The complete guide to gas station economics in the 1970s, including the full breakdown of lease negotiations, supplier contracts, tax considerations for inventory management, and the specific financial strategies that separated the survivors from those who failed, is available in the description and pinned in the comments. It goes much further than what we can cover in a single video, but the core principle remains. Ruth's station in 1979 was no longer dependent on fuel pricing to survive. Her break-even point had shifted. Even if fuel prices collapsed, her convenience retail operation alone could cover rent, utilities, and labor. The fuel sales, paradoxically, became the loss leader, the thing that brought customers through the door so they could buy higher-margin items. By 1980, Ruth's annual revenue from her single station was approximately $280,000. Of that, roughly $110,000 came from fuel sales, at an average margin of just 4%. That translated to $4,400 in gross profit from fuel. The remaining $170,000 in revenue came from convenience retail, repairs, and miscellaneous services, generating approximately $58,000 in gross profit. After fixed costs of $35,000 annually and variable costs of $12,000, she was left with approximately $11,000 in net profit annually. That $11,000 represented a return of roughly 22% on her original capital investment in the station, equipment, and initial inventory, a figure that compares favorably to most American businesses in 1980 and dramatically better than what any pure fuel-focused station could achieve at that moment in history. But survival alone is not the full story. The stations that merely survived, that broke even or made minimal profit, were not the stations that built wealth. The owners who built real wealth during this period were the ones who understood something even more subtle about the 1970s gas station economy. That something was this: they diversified not just their revenue streams but their entire asset base. Ruth, for example, did not simply invest in making her existing station more profitable. By 1977, using profits and bank credit, she had opened a second station in a different part of the city. This second location was newer with an even larger convenience store footprint, nearly 2,000 square feet, compared to her original location's 1,200 square feet. The capital required for this expansion was significant. The second station cost approximately $160,000 to build, equip, and stock initially. Ruth financed 60% through a commercial bank loan at 11.5% interest, a standard rate for small business expansion in 1977. The remaining 40% came from retained profits from the first station and a personal investment of $20,000 from her own savings. The second station was operationally more sophisticated than the first. Ruth hired a full-time manager, a man named George, who had previously worked for a large chain convenience store operator and understood the business side of retail inventory management. His salary was $14,000 annually plus benefits. Under George's management, the second station's convenience section achieved a 16% higher turning rate on inventory than Ruth's original location, meaning the product moved faster, cash conversion was quicker, and working capital requirements were lower. By 1979, the second station was generating approximately $190,000 in annual revenue with a net profit of $8,000 annually. When combined with her original station's profit, Ruth's total business was generating approximately $19,000 in annual net profit from 2 locations. The first station's real value, however, was not just its profit, it was that it had appreciated in value. Gas station real estate in many American markets appreciated steadily throughout the 1970s despite the economic turbulence. In Ruth City, a comparable gas station property that sold for $85,000 in 1970 was worth approximately $150,000 by 1979. Ruth's original location, which she had purchased for $82,000 in 1971, was worth roughly $147,000 by 1980. The appreciation was entirely separate from the operating profit. It was real wealth building happening in the background. This appreciation occurred because of several economic factors converging. First, land scarcity near main commercial corridors and highway intersections increased as suburban development accelerated and commercial zoning remained limited. Second, the barriers to entry for new gas stations rose dramatically during the 1970s due to environmental regulations, EPA compliance costs, and increased capital requirements. Third, the installed base of convenience-integrated gas stations became recognized as a proven, stable business model and therefore desirable to larger investors and chains looking to acquire portfolios. By 1980, the owner who had entered the gas station business in 1971 or 1972 with relatively modest capital could potentially be sitting on significant equity growth without having made a single aggressive business decision. They simply had to understand their numbers, adapt their model when fuel margins collapsed, and hold their position through the turbulence. The narrative of the American gas station operator in the 1970s is not ultimately a tragedy, though many individual operators experienced genuine hardship. It is rather a story of adaptation, of economic Darwinism playing out in real time across 50,000 locations nationwide. The operators who understood the numbers, who could read a profit and loss statement, who could anticipate market shifts, who had the discipline to reinvest in new revenue streams before the old ones completely collapsed, those operators not only survived but accumulated real wealth. The operators who didn't make that transition, who couldn't read or didn't believe their own data, who waited too long to diversify, who treated the convenience section as supplementary rather than primary, those operators quietly closed their doors and moved on to other work. In economic terms, their capital was reallocated to more efficient uses. In human terms, it meant the end of a way of life that had defined American entrepreneurship for 3 decades. If you want to understand the complete financial architecture of these businesses, the detailed lease structures, the supplier negotiation tactics, the inventory management systems that separated the survivors from those who failed, and the specific market conditions that varied by region, the comprehensive ebook guide is available in the description and pinned comment. It includes actual case studies, reconstructed financial statements from multiple operators, and region-specific analysis that shows how geography affected survival rates and profit potential across different American markets. The 1970s gas station economy reveals something fundamental about American business and American capitalism that remains relevant today: that the most profitable businesses are often not the ones with the highest revenue, but the ones that understand their true cost structure, identify where margins actually exist, and have the flexibility to pursue those margins even when the conventional wisdom says otherwise. Thank you for spending this time with me exploring the hidden financial machinery of one of America's most essential businesses. If you found this deep dive into the numbers and decisions that shaped the 1970s gas station economy interesting, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and activate the notification bell so you never miss when we unlock the ledger of Lost America again. I'll see you next time.